In the beginning, there was music, and in that music, there was discord. Before time itself began to flow, before the first star pierced the darkness, before mountains rose or seas filled their basins, there existed a being whose very name would become synonymous with evil incarnate. A being who would corrupt the innocent, shatter the indestructible, and bring ruin to entire ages of the world. This is the story of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, the master of Sauron, the enemy of all that is good and beautiful in creation. But before we dive into this tale of cosmic horror and ultimate evil, I want to know, what time are you watching this? Are you settling in for the night with this epic story? Or perhaps you're starting your morning with some dark Middle-earth lore? Let me know in the comments below what time it is, where you are, and whether you prefer your Tolkien content during the day or under the cover of darkness. Now, settle in, because we're about to explore the complete history of the most terrifying villain in all of fantasy literature. A being whose influence shaped the very foundations of Middle-earth, and whose shadow would linger long after his defeat. Our story begins not in Middle-earth, but in the timeless halls of Iluvatar, the one who created all things. Here, in a realm beyond physical existence, dwelt the Ainur, the Holy Ones, beings of pure spirit and immense power, each embodying different aspects of creation. Among these divine beings stood one who surpassed nearly all others in might and majesty. His name was Melkor, meaning he who arises in might. From the very moment of his creation, Melkor possessed gifts that set him apart. He was given portions of the powers of all the other Ainur, making him the mightiest among them, save for Iluvatar himself. Where Manwë commanded the winds and the breath of the world, Melkor possessed that power and more. Where Aule shaped metals in stone, Melkor knew those secrets too. Where Varda kindled the stars, Melkor understood their light and how to extinguish it. He alone among the Ainur was granted aspects of every other's domain, making him a being of unprecedented might and knowledge. This gift was intended to make him the greatest servant of Iluvatar's will, the conductor who could harmonize all the different themes into perfect unity. But with great power came great pride, and pride would be Melkor's downfall. For in possessing portions of all powers, he began to believe that he should possess all power absolutely. When Iluvatar conceived the great music of creation, the Ainulindale, he called upon the Ainur to participate in a cosmic symphony that would bring forth the world. Each voice was to contribute its part, weaving together themes of incredible beauty and complexity. The music would literally sing reality into existence. At first, Melkor sang with the rest, and his voice was among the most beautiful and powerful. The themes that flowed from him were magnificent, deep, resonant melodies that spoke of towering mountains and vast caverns, of fire that could forge and flame that could destroy, of ice that could preserve and cold that could bite with crystalline beauty. His voice added richness and complexity to the cosmic symphony that no other could provide. But as the music progressed, thoughts began to arise in his mind, thoughts that were his alone, born not from Iluvatar's design, but from his own will. He began to question why his magnificent voice should serve merely as harmony to another's theme. Why should he not compose melodies of his own? Why should beings of lesser power be granted domains that he, the mightiest, could rule far better? These thoughts manifested in his voice. Subtle at first, then growing bolder, Melkor began to weave his own themes into the music. themes that clashed with the intended harmony. Where the music called for the gentle warmth of growing things, he sang of fires that would consume them. Where it spoke of light that would comfort and guide, he introduced darkness that would hide and mislead. Where it proclaimed growth and life and the laughter of children yet to be, he countered with decay and death and the weeping of those who would mourn. The discord spread like a poison through the symphony. Some of the Ainur, confused and dismayed by these alien themes, fell silent, unsure how to continue their parts. Others tried desperately to maintain their original melodies, but found them increasingly difficult to sustain against the growing cacophony. A few, drawn by the power and boldness of Melkor's music, began to echo his themes, adding their voices to his rebellion. What had begun as perfect harmony became a war of music. With each note, a battle between the forces of creation and destruction. Melkor's themes grew ever more dominating, ever more discordant, seeking not merely to add to the music, but to overwhelm and replace it entirely. But Ilúvatar was not dismayed. 3 times he introduced new themes, each time showing how even Melkor's discord could be woven into a greater harmony, how even rebellion could serve the ultimate design. In the end, Melkor found that his most terrible discords had become unwittingly part of a glory beyond his understanding. When the music finally ended, Ilúvatar showed the Ainur a vision of what their song had created. A world of incredible beauty and complexity, where even the darkness served to highlight the light, where even suffering would lead to greater joy. This world was called the world that island, but Melkor's rebellion had left its mark. The world that was shown to them bore the scars of his discord. It would be a place where evil could exist alongside good, where corruption could spread, where beauty could be marred and innocence lost. Many of the Ainur were content to remain in the timeless halls and contemplate the vision they had seen. But some, moved by love for the world that had been revealed to them, desired to enter into it and help guide its development. These willing servants of Eru's design were given leave to enter the physical realm, though in doing so they would be bound by the laws of time and matter until the world's end. Among those who chose to enter Ea was Melkor, but his motivations were far different from the others. Where they came as servants and guardians, he came as a conqueror. He had been the first to conceive of the world during the music, and in his pride, he considered it rightfully his to rule. The Ainur who entered the world became known as the Valar, the powers of Arda, and their servants were called the Maiar. They took upon themselves physical forms, though these forms were more like clothing to their spirits than true bodies. They could change their appearance at will, and their power was vast. They could reshape mountains, command the seas, and kindle stars. Melkor arrived before the others, and immediately set about claiming dominion over everything he found. But the world was still young and unformed, and his efforts to control it often resulted in destruction rather than creation. Where the other Valar worked together to bring order and beauty to Arda, Melkor worked alone, and his works bore the mark of his solitary pride. When the other Valar arrived and began their great works of creation, they found Melkor's hand everywhere, and rarely for the good. The world that should have been a paradise bore signs of violence and discord. Mountains had been raised only to be thrown down, seas had been filled only to be emptied, and everywhere was the evidence of conflict and waste. For countless years, the war between Melkor and the Valar raged across the young world. This was no war as mortals would understand it, but a conflict of cosmic proportions, where the very foundations of reality were the battlefield. Continents were reshaped like clay in a potter's hands. Oceans were moved from one basin to another as easily as water poured from a cup, and the very axis of the world was altered by their conflicts. The violence of this primordial war was beyond imagination. Melkor would raise mountain ranges only to hurl them down in avalanches that shook the world to its core. He would boil seas into steam and freeze them into glaciers that ground everything beneath them to powder. Where the Valar built, he destroyed. Where they planted, he burned. Where they brought order, he sowed chaos with methodical precision. Each defeat taught Melkor new lessons in malice. When the Valar threw down his first fortress of Utumno, he built it again deeper and more terrible than before. When they scattered his first armies of corrupted beings, he bred new ones that were swifter, stronger, and more cruel. With each cycle of destruction and rebuilding, he grew not weaker, but more cunning, more vicious, more completely devoted to the work of ruin. The Valar, for their part, began to understand that they faced an enemy unlike any they had imagined. This was not mere opposition to their plans, but a fundamental rejection of the very concept of creation itself. Melkor had become something new in the world, not just a rebel, but an embodiment of the principle of unmaking, a force that sought not to rule creation but to unmake it entirely. Melkor was mighty, mightier than any single Valar, and his power was magnified by his willingness to corrupt and destroy what he could not control. But he could not stand against all of them united, and their combined might was still greater than his solitary strength. Time and again he was thrown down, his fortresses destroyed, his works undone, his servants scattered to the darkest corners of the world. But each defeat only fed his hatred, and his hatred grew until it consumed all other aspects of his being. Love, curiosity, the joy of creation, all of these were burned away in the furnace of his rage, leaving only malice and the desire for revenge. He became less than he had been, diminished by his own evil, yet paradoxically more dangerous because he had nothing left to lose. As the ages passed, the Valar gradually brought order to Arda. They established the cycles of day and night, created the foundations of land and sea, and prepared the world for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, the elves and men who would one day awaken. To light the world in those elder days, the Valar created two great trees in their blessed realm of Valinor. Telperion bore flowers of silver that gave forth a gentle light, while Laurelin bore fruits of gold that shone with the radiance of the Sunday. These trees were the most beautiful things in all of Arda, and their light was pure and healing. It was during this time that Melkor, now dwelling in the northern wastes in a fortress called Utumno, began his most heinous work. Unable to create life himself, for that power belonged to Ilúvatar alone, he instead turned to corruption. This was perhaps the most terrible discovery of his long rebellion, that while he could not create, he could twist and pervert what had already been made. When the first elves awakened in the eastern lands of Middle-earth, by the waters of Cuivianen under starlight, many were taken by hunters in the dark. These hunters were Melkor's servants, spirits he had corrupted from among the Maiar, creatures of shadow and terror that could move unseen in the darkness. The captured elves were brought to the deep pits of Utumno, to dungeons that lay far beneath the earth where no light had ever shone. There, through torture that lasted for years, through corruption both physical and spiritual, through unspeakable experiments in malice and pain, Melkor twisted these noble beings into something hideous and base. The process was slow and methodical, for he took a craftsman's care in his work of destruction. He broke their minds first, then their spirits, then their very bodies, remaking them according to his own twisted vision. The beautiful elves, with their fair faces and noble hearts, became the first orcs, creatures of malice and hatred, bound to their master's will. But they were not mere puppets. They retained enough of their original intelligence to understand the horror of what they had become, which made their torment all the greater. They were living reminders of Melkor's power to corrupt even the most perfect of Iluvatar's creations. This was perhaps Melkor's greatest crime, the one that marked his final transformation from a rebel seeking power to a monster seeking only destruction. For in corrupting the elves, he had not merely created servants, partsies. He had proven that nothing, no matter how beautiful or good, was beyond his power to defile. It was a victory over innocence itself, and it filled him with a satisfaction more complete than any mere conquest could provide. But Melkor's ambitions grew beyond even this terrible achievement. He began to covet the light of the two trees, that pure radiance that stood as a symbol of everything he opposed. He could not bear that such beauty should exist beyond his power to corrupt or destroy. To accomplish his dark purpose, Melkor allied himself with Ungoliant, a creature of shadow and hunger that dwelt in the southern darkness. Ungoliant was a being whose origins were shrouded in mystery. Some said she was a corrupted Maya, others that she was something older and more alien, a remnant of the void that existed before creation. What was certain was her nature. She was hunger, incarnate, an endless appetite that could never be satisfied. She dwelt in a realm of perpetual twilight, weaving webs of impenetrable darkness that could snare light itself. Her form was that of a gigantic spider, but no mortal spider had ever possessed such malevolent intelligence or such terrible power. She could weave darkness as other creatures wove silk, creating veils of shadow so thick that even the light of the Valar could not penetrate them. Melkor sought her out in her dark domain, offering her a bargain that appealed to her insatiable nature. He promised her the light of the two trees themselves, if she would aid him in their destruction. For Ungoliant, the prospect of devouring such pure radiance was irresistible, and she agreed to the alliance, though neither trusted the other. Together, they conceived a plan that would plunge all of Arda into darkness. They would strike when the Valar were distracted, when their attention was turned elsewhere, and they would destroy the very source of light in the world. The opportunity came during the great feast of double mirth, when both trees bloomed simultaneously in a rare moment of perfect radiance. All the Valar and many of the Eldar had gathered in the halls of Manwë on the peak of Tanaquil, celebrating the beauty of the light and the harmony it represented. On this day when the Valar had gathered for a great feast, Melkor and Ungoliant struck with coordinated precision. They came upon the two trees in the hour when both were dim, in the brief twilight between their cycles of blooming when the great plaza of Mahanaxar lay in shadow. Melkor came first, his great spear Grond gleaming with malice in the dim light. The weapon had been forged in the fires of his hatred, tempered with his malice, and sharpened with his envy. When he drove it into the trunk of Telperion, the silver tree shuddered as if in mortal agony, its light flickering and beginning to fade. Then came Ungoliant, her massive form flowing like liquid shadow across the ground. She set her mouth to the wounds that Melkor had made and began to drink. But it was not just the sap of the trees that she consumed. It was their very light, their life, their essence. As she drank, the radiance that had blessed Valinor for countless years began to dim and die. The trees withered and died, their light failing forever. Telperion's silver flowers blackened and fell like snow, while Laurelin's golden fruit withered on the branch and crashed to the ground with sounds like thunder. All of Valinor was plunged into darkness deeper than any night, and with it, much of the world lost the blessing of the tree's illumination. But Ungoliant's appetite, once awakened, proved impossible to satisfy. As she drained the last light from the dying trees, she swelled in size and power, becoming a creature of such terrible might that even Melkor began to fear what he had unleashed. Her hunger turned toward him, and she demanded that he fulfill his part of the bargain by giving her more to devour. But Melkor's treachery did not end there. While the Valar mourned their great loss, he struck again, this time at the hidden fortress where the Noldor and Elves kept their greatest treasures. There in the halls of Forminos lay the Silmarils, 3 jewels created by Fëanor, the greatest of Elvish craftsmen. These gems contained within them the captured light of the 2 trees, preserved forever in crystal, more beautiful than diamond, harder than adamant. They were the most precious things in all of Arda, and Melkor desired them with a consuming passion. He slew Finwë, High King of the Noldor, and seized the Silmarils for himself. Then he fled northward, bearing his stolen treasures to his new fortress of Angband, which he had delved in the northwest of Middle-earth. But in stealing the Silmarils, Melkor had made an enemy who had proved to be his equal in pride and wrath. Fëanor, creator of the jewels and son of the slain king, swore a terrible oath of vengeance. He and his 7 sons bound themselves with words that could not be broken, swearing to pursue anyone who held the Silmarils to the ends of the earth and beyond. It was Fëanor who first gave Melkor the name by which he would be known thereafter, Morgoth, the black foe of the world. No longer was he called by the name that spoke of might and majesty, but by one that revealed his true nature, an enemy of all that lived and grew and flourished. Morgoth's theft of the Silmarils set in motion events that would dominate the entire First Age of Middle-earth. Fëanor and a great host of the Noldor and Elves left Valinor in pursuit of the Dark Lord. Despite the warnings and pleas of the Valar, they were determined to reclaim their treasures and avenge their king, no matter the cost. This exodus of the Noldor was marked by terrible deeds. In their haste to pursue Morgoth, they committed the first kinslaying, attacking their own people to steal their ships. The blood spilled in this crime would haunt them throughout all their years in Middle-earth. When the Noldor finally reached Middle-earth, they found a realm already corrupted by Morgoth's influence. From his fortress of Angband, he had spread his dominion across much of the north. His orc armies ravaged the land, and his servants included not only the corrupted elves, but also Balrogs, fallen Maiar, who had been seduced to his service in the earliest days. Chief among these servants was one who would later be known as Sauron, though in those days he was called Gorthor the Cruel. He was a Maya of Aule the Smith originally, but he had been corrupted by Morgoth's lies and promises of power. Under Morgoth's tutelage, he became a master of deception and domination, learning the arts that would serve him well in later ages. The wars that followed spanned more than 6 centuries, and they were wars such as Middle-earth had never seen before and would never see again. The Noldor established great kingdoms in Beleriand, Gondolin the Hidden, Nargothrond, the Underground Fortress, and many others. They fought with desperate valor against overwhelming odds, winning great victories and suffering terrible defeats. Morgoth's power seemed inexhaustible. From the breeding pits of Angband came endless hosts of orcs, and he commanded creatures of such terrible might that their names alone inspired fear. There was Glaurung, the first of the fire drakes, a dragon of immense size and malevolent intelligence. There were the Balrogs, demons of shadow and flame who wielded whips of fire and struck terror into the bravest hearts. But perhaps most terrible of all was Morgoth himself when he chose to take the field. Unlike his servant Sauron, who preferred to work through manipulation and deception, Morgoth was a being of direct and overwhelming force. When he appeared in battle, his presence alone could break the courage of armies. His weapon was Grond, the hammer of the underworld, and his armor was black as the void between the stars. The history of the wars against Morgoth is marked by a series of great battles, each more devastating than the last. The first was Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Battle Under Stars, where Fëanor himself fell, slain by Balrogs in his reckless pursuit of the enemy. His death marked the beginning of the long struggle, and though the Noldor won that first battle, they paid for it with the life of their greatest leader. For many years, the Elves held their own against Morgoth's forces. They established the Siege of Angband, maintaining a watchful guard around the Dark Lord's fortress. For nearly 4 centuries, this siege held, and it seemed that perhaps Morgoth could be contained if not defeated. But the Dark Lord was not idle during these years. Deep in the pits of Angband, he labored to create new weapons of war. He bred dragons in ever greater numbers and of ever-increasing size and power. He corrupted more of the elves to create new breeds of orcs, each more terrible than the last, and he searched for ways to break the siege that held him prisoner in his own fortress. The breakthrough came with the creation of Glaurung, the first of the Urukloki, or fire drakes. This dragon was a creature of immense power, resistant to weapons and able to breathe fire that could melt the strongest armor. When Glaurung first emerged from Angband, he scattered the elven armies like leaves before a storm. But Glaurung was merely the harbinger of greater evil to come. In the 455th year of the siege, Morgoth unveiled his ultimate weapon, an army of such size and power that it broke the siege like a twig. This was the Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, and it marked the beginning of the end for the elven kingdoms of Beleriand. The battle began with rivers of fire that poured from Angband, burning everything in their path. The green lands around the fortress were turned to ash and wasteland. Then came the orcs, not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands, wave after wave of them, accompanied by dragons and balrogs and other creatures of shadow. The siege of Angband was broken, and Morgoth's forces poured out across Beleriand like a dark flood. The elven armies were scattered and driven back, their carefully prepared defenses overrun. Many of their greatest heroes fell in that terrible battle, and the hope of containing Morgoth died with them. With the breaking of the siege of Angband, Morgoth entered into a period of dominance that would last for nearly 2 centuries. His armies ranged across all of Beleriand, destroying everything in their path. The great elven cities fell one by one, their people slain or scattered to the winds. Morgoth's cruelty during this period was beyond description. He did not simply seek military victory. He sought the complete corruption and destruction of everything good and beautiful in the world. His armies were instructed not merely to conquer but to defile, not merely to kill but to torment. Captured enemies were not merely killed but tortured in ways that defied imagination. Their suffering prolonged not for any practical purpose but for the simple pleasure that Morgoth took in their pain. The Dark Lord had learned that physical pain, terrible as it was, could be endured by those with sufficient courage and purpose. But the corruption of the spirit was a far more effective weapon. He became a master of psychological warfare, using a victim's own love and loyalty as weapons against them. Parents were forced to watch their children corrupted into orcs. Heroes were shown the futility of their struggles by being made to witness the destruction of everything they had fought to protect. Prisoners were corrupted into orcs, or worse, their very essence twisted until they became weapons to use against their former allies. But perhaps most terrible of all were those who were only partially corrupted, beings who retained enough of their original nature to understand what they had become, yet were powerless to resist their new dark impulses. These wretched creatures served as living examples of Morgoth's power to destroy not just bodies, but souls. The Dark Lord took particular pleasure in the corruption of noble beings. He would seek out the greatest heroes, the most virtuous leaders, the most beloved figures among his enemies, and devote special attention to their destruction. For Morgoth understood that the fall of a single great soul could demoralize entire armies, while the corruption of a beloved leader could shatter the faith of thousands. When he captured the elven king Finrod Felagund, he did not simply execute him, but subjected him to torments designed to break his will and spirit. He showed him visions of the future, destruction of all the elven kingdoms, the corruption of the forests he loved, the transformation of his people into creatures of darkness. The king's love for his people became a source of agony as Morgoth used it to multiply his suffering. When Turin-Turambar, one of the great heroes of men, fell under his influence, Morgoth orchestrated a series of tragedies that turned the hero's greatest strengths into sources of doom. The man's courage led him into disasters. His love brought pain to those he cherished, and his noble spirit became a burden that crushed him beneath its weight. Every virtue was transformed into a weapon of destruction, every act of heroism into a cause of greater sorrow. Perhaps most terrible of all was Morgoth's treatment of Hurin, a lord of men who had defied him in battle. Rather than killing Hurin, Morgoth chained him to a chair atop Thangorodrim, the three-peaked mountain that rose above Angband, and forced him to watch as curse after curse fell upon his family. For 28 years, Hurin was compelled to observe the slow destruction of everything he loved, unable to act or even to warn them of their approaching doom. Morgoth would visit Hurin regularly, standing beside his chained prisoner to gloat over each new tragedy that befell the Edain Lord's descendants. He would explain in loving detail how each disaster had been orchestrated, how each moment of happiness had been allowed only to make the subsequent sorrow more acute. The Dark Lord fed on Hurin's anguish like a vampire feeds on blood, growing stronger with each tear that fell from the captive's eyes. This was Morgoth's way, not simply to destroy his enemies, but to make them instruments of their own destruction and the destruction of those they loved. His mind had become so consumed with malice that he could find pleasure only in the suffering of others, and that pleasure was most acute when the suffering was inflicted by love turned against itself. Despite Morgoth's apparent dominance, pockets of resistance remained. The greatest of these was Gondolin, the hidden city built by Turgon in a secret valley surrounded by mountains. For centuries, Gondolin remained undiscovered, its people safe behind walls of impregnable stone and veils of concealment. Another refuge was Doriath, the kingdom of Thingol and Melian, protected by the power of Melian the Maya. Her girdle of enchantment kept Morgoth's servants at bay, though it could not prevent the internal strife that would eventually bring about the kingdom's fall. From these hidden strongholds, the Elves continued their resistance. They could no longer hope to defeat Morgoth in open battle, but they could harry his forces, rescue prisoners, and keep alive the hope that somehow, someday, the Dark Lord might be overthrown. It was during this period that some of the greatest heroes of the Elder Days lived and died. There was Beren, a mortal man who dared to steal a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, aided by Luthien, daughter of Thingol, whose beauty and power of song could charm even the Dark Lord himself. There was Tuor, guided by the Vala Ulmo to the gates of Gondolin, where he would father Eärendil, the mariner who would one day carry the light of a Silmaril across the sky. But perhaps the greatest of all was Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, who in his despair and rage rode alone to the gates of Angband and challenged Morgoth himself to single combat. The Dark Lord, shamed before his servants, was forced to accept the challenge and take the field himself. The duel that followed was witnessed by eagles and reported in song for all time. Fingolfin was mighty, the greatest warrior among the elves, and his sword, Ringgold, bit deep into Morgoth's flesh 7 times before the end. But the Dark Lord was a being of the Ainur, and his power was far beyond that of any child of Eru, no matter how noble or skilled. In the end, Morgoth slew Fingolfin with his great mace Grond, but not before the Elf King had dealt him a wound that would never heal, a permanent limp that would mar the Dark Lord's form until the end of his days. Even in defeat, Fingolfin had achieved something no other being had managed. He had marked Morgoth's flesh and shown that the Dark Lord, for all his power, was not invulnerable. As the centuries passed, even the mightiest refuges began to fall. The discovery of Gondolin came about through treachery, when Maeglin, nephew of King Turgon, was captured and tortured until he revealed the secret paths to the hidden city. Morgoth's armies, led by dragons and balrogs, poured through the passes and laid siege to the city. The fall of Gondolin was one of the most terrible events of the First Age. The city that had been a beacon of hope and beauty for half a millennium was destroyed in a single night of fire and sword. King Turgon perished defending his halls, and most of his people died with him. Only a few escaped, led by Tuor and Idril, carrying with them the young Eärendil, who would one day play a crucial role in Morgoth's ultimate defeat. Nargothrond had fallen earlier, betrayed by the treachery of men who served Morgoth. Doriath, the last of the great elven kingdoms, fell not to Morgoth's direct assault, but to civil war, as the sons of Fëanor sought to reclaim a Silmaril that had come into Thingol's possession. By the end of the 6th century since the return of the Noldor, Morgoth's dominion over Beleriand seemed complete. The great elven armies had been scattered or destroyed, their cities burned, their kings slain. The few survivors huddled in hidden refuges along the coast, protected only by the power of Círdan the shipwright and his mariners. It seemed that the Dark Lord had won, that the oath of Fëanor would never be fulfilled, and that the Silmarils would remain forever in Morgoth's crown. The age of the elves appeared to be ending in defeat and despair. But Ilúvatar had not abandoned his children, and even in the darkest hour, hope remained. That hope took the form of Eärendil the Mariner, son of Tuor and Idril, last prince of fallen Gondolin. With his wife Elwing, who bore one of the Silmarils rescued from the ruin of Doriath, Eärendil conceived a desperate plan. Taking his ship, Vingelot, Eärendil set out upon the great sea, seeking the hidden path to Valinor. For many years he searched, encountering strange islands and terrible perils, but always the way was hidden from him. The Valar had closed the route to the Undying Lands after the rebellion of the Noldor, and no mortal ship could find the straight path. But Eärendil carried with him the Silmaril of Luthien and Beren, and its light was a power that even the Valar could not ignore. When at last his ship found the harbor of Valinor, the Eldar who dwelt there marveled at the light that shone from his brow. For Eärendil had bound the Silmaril to his forehead, and it blazed with the captured radiance of the two trees themselves. Arundel came before the throne of Manwë, mightiest of the Valar, and spoke as an ambassador for both elves and men. He begged the Valar to have pity on the children of Eru, to intervene before Morgoth's evil could spread beyond Beleriand to corrupt all of Middle-earth. His plea was heard with compassion, for the Valar had long grieved over the sufferings that their failure to stop Morgoth had brought upon the world. The decision was made. The Valar would come forth from Valinor in their full might and make an end of Morgoth's tyranny. This would be the War of Wrath, the final battle between the forces of good and evil in the first age of Middle-earth. The host that came out of Valinor was unlike anything Middle-earth had ever seen. The Valar themselves took part, their true forms revealed for the first time since the early days of Arda. Manwë came with the power of all the winds of the world at his command, able to call down lightning from clear skies and command the very air to do his bidding. Varda came clothed in starlight, her presence driving back the shadows that had long covered the northern lands. Tulkas the Strong strode across the battlefield like a force of nature, his laughter echoing like thunder as he scattered Morgoth's armies before him. Along with the Valar came great numbers of the Maiar, beings of power who had remained in Valinor throughout the long wars. They came not as the diminished forms that Gandalf and Saruman would later take, but in their full might, shining like stars fallen to earth. Each one was mightier than the greatest of elven lords, and together they formed an army that made the very foundations of Middle-earth tremble. There was also a vast army of elves who had remained in the Undying Lands, the Vanir, fairest of the elven kindreds, who had never known the taint of Middle-earth's sorrows. They came arrayed in armor that shone like silver and gold, bearing weapons forged in the fires of creation itself. Their voices rang out in songs of war that had not been heard since the music of creation, and their presence brought hope to lands that had known only darkness for centuries. But most terrifying of all to Morgoth's forces were the Eagles of Manwë, led by Thorondor, their king, and greatest among all flying creatures. These were not mere birds, but beings of noble spirit and ancient wisdom, each one larger than the greatest of dragons. When they darkened the sky with their wings, even the Balrogs cowered, for the eagles were servants of Manwë himself, and their cry could shatter stone and pierce the hearts of the wicked with despair. When this host appeared in the skies above Middle-earth, even Morgoth's courage faltered. For centuries, he had grown accustomed to being the strongest power in the world, able to overwhelm any opposition through sheer force. His armies had seemed inexhaustible, his fortresses impregnable, his victory inevitable. Now he faced beings who were his equals or superiors, led by Eonwë, herald of Manwë, and mightiest of all the Maiar. The war that followed was devastating beyond description. The very foundations of the earth were shaken by the conflict, and the shape of the world itself was changed by the forces unleashed. Mountains were leveled as easily as sandcastles. Seas boiled under the heat of dragonfire and the lightning of the Valar, and the sky itself was torn by the clash of powers too great for the physical world to contain. The sound of the battle could be heard from the Grey Havens to the Sea of Rhûn, a constant thunder that never ceased. The light of burning dragons and the radiance of the Valar's weapons turned night into day across all of Middle-earth. Rivers changed their courses to avoid the battlefields, and the very stars seemed to flicker in the heavens as cosmic forces clashed below. Morgoth's armies, for all their vast numbers, were no match for the host of Valinor. His orcs were scattered like dust before the wind. His Balrogs were destroyed or driven into hiding, and even his mighty dragons fell before the assault. Glaurung, the golden father of dragons, was slain, and many of his offspring perished with him. But Morgoth had one final weapon, kept in reserve for such a desperate hour. From the deepest pits of Angband he released Ancalagon the Black, greatest of all dragons, whose wingspan was said to blot out the Sunday. Ancalagon was a creature of such immense size and power that the mountains shook beneath his wings, and his fire could melt stone and metal like wax. For a time, it seemed that even the host of Valinor might be defeated by this ultimate expression of Morgoth's malice. Ancalagon swept the skies clear of enemies, and his fire drove back even the Maiar who opposed him. The tide of battle hung in the balance, and the very fate of Middle-earth seemed to rest upon a knife's edge. But then came Arundel in his ship Vingilet, the Silmaril blazing upon his brow like a star of hope. With him flew Thorndor and the great eagles, and together they gave battle to Ancalagon above the peaks of Thangorodrim. The conflict that followed was witnessed from afar, as star-bright Vingilat and shadow-black Ancalagon wheeled and dove in deadly combat high above the earth. In the end, it was Arundel who struck the killing blow, and Ancalagon fell from the sky like a thunderbolt. His massive body crashed down upon the peaks of Thangorodrim, and the threefold mountain was broken and ruined by the impact. With the death of Ancalagon, Morgoth's last hope of victory died as well. His fortress of Angband lay open to assault, its defenses shattered, its guardian destroyed. The host of Valinor poured through the broken gates and into the deepest dungeons where the Dark Lord had taken refuge. They found Morgoth there, cowering in the depths like a wild beast at bay. Gone was the mighty Vala who had once sung in the music of creation. Gone was the proud rebel who had challenged Eru himself. What remained was a creature of pure malice and hatred, diminished by ages of evil doing until he was but a shadow of his former self. The Dark Lord was taken captive and bound with the chain Anganor, which had been forged specifically for this purpose by Auli the Smith. So great was Morgoth's terror that he did not even attempt to resist, and he was dragged forth from his ruined fortress to face the judgment of the Valar. The Silmarils were recovered from his crown, though the crown itself had to be beaten into a collar for his neck as an additional symbol of his defeat. 2 of the jewels were given to the sons of Fëanor, as was their right, though the holy light burned their hands because of the evil they had done in pursuit of their oath. The 3rd Silmaril remained with Arundel, who was set to sail the skies as a sign of hope to all who dwelt in darkness. As for Morgoth himself, his fate was more terrible than death. The Valar thrust him through the door of night into the timeless void beyond the circles of the world. There he was to remain until the end of days, unable to return to trouble Middle-earth again. But his evil was not so easily contained. Though Morgoth was gone, his corruption remained, poisoning the very fabric of the world. His servant Sauron escaped the destruction of Angband and would one day rise to become the new Dark Lord. The orcs that Morgoth had bred scattered to the far corners of Middle-earth, carrying their master's malice into the ages that would follow. The defeat of Morgoth marked the end of the first age of Middle-earth, but it also marked the beginning of a new and darker era. The War of Wrath had been so devastating that most of Beleriand was broken and sunk beneath the waves. The great elven kingdoms were gone forever, their glory nothing but a memory preserved in song. The beautiful lands where the Noldor had built their realms lay drowned beneath the Beligare, and with them went millennia of art, knowledge, and culture that could never be recovered. Many of the Elves, weary of war and loss, sailed over the sea to Valinor, never to return. Those who remained found a world much diminished from its former glory. The magic was fading from Middle-earth. The power of the elven rings could not restore what had been lost. and the time of the Elves was drawing to a close. The Fourth Age, the Age of Men, was approaching, and with it would come a world more prosaic, less touched by the divine. Yet perhaps most terrible of all was the knowledge that Morgoth's evil had become part of the very structure of the world. His discord in the music of creation had ensured that suffering and evil would always be possible in Arda. His corruption of the elves into orcs had introduced a strain of irredeemable evil into the world that would persist until the end of days. His poisoning of the earth itself had created wounds that would never fully heal. Every act of cruelty, every moment of despair, every shadow that fell across the hearts of the free peoples could be traced back to his influence. The petty jealousies that led to strife among friends, the pride that caused the mighty to fall, the fear that paralyzed the brave in their hour of greatest need, all of these bore the mark of Morgoth's original rebellion. His servant Sauron would rise again in later ages, wielding the arts his master had taught him, creating new instruments of domination and control. The orcs would survive and multiply, spreading their corruption throughout Middle-earth. Dragons would continue to be born from the remnants of Morgoth's breeding programs, terrorizing the world for ages to come. But more insidious than any of these visible evils was the spiritual corruption that Morgoth had introduced into the world. He had proven that even the greatest good could be turned to evil purpose, that even the most noble intentions could lead to terrible consequences, that even the purest love could become a source of destruction. This knowledge would haunt the wise throughout all the ages that followed. The concept of the Morgoth element, the spiritual poison that the Dark Lord had introduced into the very fabric of reality, would become a recurring theme in the later history of Middle-earth. It was this element that made possible the corruption of Saruman, the pride of the Númenóreans, the jealousy between elves and dwarves, and countless other tragedies, great and small. This was Morgoth's ultimate victory, not in conquest, but in corruption. He had proven that even the most beautiful creation could be marred, that even the noblest hearts could be turned to evil, that even the mightiest powers could fall to temptation. His legacy would echo through all the ages of the world, a reminder that the price of peace is eternal vigilance against the darkness within. The shadow he cast was so long that even in the Fourth Age, when men had become the dominant people of Middle-earth, and most had forgotten the very name of Morgoth, his influence could still be felt. Every war, every act of hatred, every moment when despair overwhelmed hope bore some trace of the discord he had first introduced into the music of creation. In the end, Morgoth's story is both a warning and a tragedy, a warning of what pride and ambition can lead to when unchecked by wisdom and humility, a tragedy of a being who possessed the power to create wonders beyond imagination, but chose instead to become the enemy of all creation. The Dark Lord, who once sang with the voice of an angel, had become something far worse than any demon. He had become the destroyer of hope itself. And though he was defeated and cast out beyond the world, his shadow would forever remain, a testament to the terrible truth that evil is not some external force that can be simply defeated, but a corruption that dwells within the heart of every thinking being. This is the complete history of Morgoth, the black foe of the world, the first and greatest of the Dark Lords. From his glorious beginning as mightiest of the Ainur to his ignominious end as a chained prisoner thrust into the void, his story spans the entire First Age of Middle-earth and beyond. Remember his tale, for in understanding the nature of ultimate evil, we come to better appreciate the value of the light that stands against it. In seeing how far even the mightiest can fall, we learn to guard our own hearts against the temptations of pride and power. And in knowing that even Morgoth, terrible as he was, could not ultimately triumph over the design of Eru Iluvatar, we find hope that no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come at last. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkest chapters of Middle-earth's history. Don't forget to let me know in the comments what time you watched this. I'm genuinely curious about when people prefer to dive into these epic tales of good versus evil. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Morgoth's complete story, there are many more tales from Tolkien's legendarium waiting to be explored. Until next time, may your own music add harmony to the great song of creation, and may you never forget that even in the darkest hour, hope remains.